Al-Aqsa to all. Saudi Arabia, Oman, signal new Syria normalization. This is thecradle.co. Oman offers support to Syria during official visit of the President Assad. President Assad's visit to Oman continues the trend of the normalization of relations with the Gulf states in the wake of massive earthquake in February. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad visited the Sultanate of Oman on Monday, 20 February, where Sultan Haytham bin Tariq received him at the airport, after which a series of official talks were held at Al Baraka Palace in Muscat. The official website of the Presidency of the Syrian Republic stated, His Majesty the Sultan renewed his condolences to President al-Assad and the Syrian people for the victims of the devastating earthquake, stressing his country's continued support for Syria to overcome the effects of the earthquake and the repercussions of the war and the siege imposed on the Syrian people, noting that Oman feels the difficult conditions that Syrians are living in due to these factors. The Sultan also stated that Syria is a brotherly Arab country and that he looked forward to normalizing ties between Syria and all other Arab states. Oman was among the few Arab countries that didn't join the U.S.-led regime change proxy war against Syria from 2011 to 2018. Meanwhile, President Assad expressed his deep appreciation for the Sultan and Oman's support and relief aid to the Syrian population following the devastating earthquake. The president also expressed his gratitude for Oman's support in Syria's war on terror. The talks dealt with bilateral relations between the two countries and explored areas of joint cooperation. The two sides also discussed developments in the regional and international arenas and efforts to support and enhance regional security and stability. President Assad's visit to Oman followed a number of recent meetings between Syrian officials and their Omani counterparts in an effort to normalize ties between Syria and the Gulf states. According to a report published by Sharq al-Awsat, the recent earthquake gave Syria's Arab neighbors the pretext to take steps towards normalization with Syria, which was previously impossible due to pressure among the U.S. government. Many states, including Saudi Arabia, which played a key role in the U.S.-led war against Syria, have provided earthquake relief aid to Syria despite the U.S.-imposed economic embargo on the country. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan al Saud said on 18 February that there is consensus growing in the Arab world for the reintegration of Syria into the regional fold. More on that later. The Saudi minister stressed that the isolation of Damascus is no longer feasible and that dialogue is needed at some point, at the very least, to address humanitarian issues such as refugee repatriation. Dozens of planes of relief aid from around the world, including Russia, Iran, China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Egypt, and others, have now reached Syria. And from Middle East Eye, dialogue needed with Syria government, says Saudi Foreign Minister. Faisal bin Farhan says status quo not working as Assad seeks to mend ties with former foes following the earthquake. Arab states are in agreement that the isolation of Damascus is not working and a dialogue with the Syrian government should be reopened, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister has said. Faisal bin Farhan al Saud was speaking to reporters on Saturday during a security forum in Munich. In the Arab world, there is consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. We all have policies, but we don't have any strategy to implement that policy, he said. Saudi Arabia and its regional allies backed so-called rebels in the early days of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011 after President Bashar al-Assad's forces cracked down on peaceful protests. The United Arab Emirates has been at the forefront of bringing Syria back into the regional fold, reopening its Syrian embassy in 2018 and welcoming Assad to Abu Dhabi and Dubai last year during his first trip to an Arab state since the start of the war. Assad and Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed enjoy excellent relations, a senior intelligence officer from an Arab state neighboring Syria told MEE last week. Last Wednesday, the UAE announced it had pledged a total of $100 million to Syria after two earthquakes devastated northern parts of the country and southern Turkey on 6 February. Riyadh had been slower to re-engage with Syria through Saudi intelligence chief Khalid al-Humaydan visited Damascus in 2021. Last week, a Saudi plane loaded with earthquake aid landed in government-controlled Aleppo, marking the first such flight since the two countries severed ties in 2012. The Emiratis are leading on the diplomatic response to the quake, and Saudi Arabia is watching. Andrew Tobler, a senior fellow at Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Syria director on the White House National Security Council, told MEE. Dialogue with Damascus needed. Faisal bin Farhan said the region needed to rethink the way in which it addresses the main crisis points in relation to Syria. We have an issue regarding refugees in Jordan and Lebanon that are a significant drag on those economies at a very delicate time. We've significant suffering now, especially with the earthquake, he said. The status quo isn't going to relieve any of that suffering. He added that dialogue with the government in Damascus would be necessary to deal with these issues. The most prominent diplomatic visit to Syria in the last 2 weeks has come from Jordan. Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi met with Assad in Damascus on Wednesday, marking the first such trip since the Syrian war erupted. The Hashemite Kingdom, a key U.S. ally in the region, went against the bipartisan consensus in Washington that continues to call for treating Assad as a pariah. Earlier this month, the U.S. announced it was easing sanctions on Syria for 180 days for transactions related to earthquake relief efforts. In Egypt, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi called his Syrian counterpart, a day after the quake, the first such communication between the leaders. Meanwhile, Kuwait's foreign minister told Reuters during the Munich summit that it was not dealing directly with Damascus and was providing earthquake aid via international organizations and Turkey. And from Memo, Middle East Monitor, Syria, Assad visits Oman in first post-earthquake trip. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad traveled to Oman on Monday, his office said, his first foreign trip since the deadly earthquake and a sign of easing isolation after nearly 12 years of civil war, Reuters reports. Arab states have poured aid into Syria since the 6 February quake killed more than 5,900 people there, according to a tally of UN and Syrian government figures. Donors have included Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which both supported rebels seeking to overthrow Assad in the early years of the Syrian conflict. Assad met with Oman's ruling Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, who said he looked forward to Syria's ties with all Arab countries returning to normal, according to a statement from the Syrian presidency. Oman withdrew its ambassador to Syria in 2012 as other Gulf states downgraded or shut missions there in response to the Damascus government's crackdown on anti-government protests at the start of the conflict. Maybe we should unpack this term crackdown as well. It's been used multiple times, and it's not a it's a compound word. It's not even like a legitimate term as far as I'm concerned. But Muscat kept up contacts with Syria despite pressure from the U.S. and reinstated its ambassador in 2020, the first Gulf state to do so. Since then, there have been signs of a shift in the Middle East towards reviving ties with Assad, a change accelerated by the earthquake. Jordan's foreign minister made his first trip to Damascus last week, and on 7 February, Assad and Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, spoke by phone for the first time. The UAE's foreign minister met Assad in Damascus a week ago, his third such visit since the beginning of the war. Assad's previous visit to the UAE in March last year was his first trip to an Arab state since the outbreak of a civil war in 2011. He rarely left Syria during the war, traveling only to close allies Russia and Iran, whose military support helped Assad turn the tide of the conflict. And in Al-Mayadeen, al-Assad in a visit to Muscat, region now more in need of Oman. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad made a visit on Monday to the Sultanate of Oman, where he was received at the royal private airport by the Sultan of Oman, Haytham bin Tariq. Al-Assad and bin Tariq held an official session of talks at al-Baraka Palace in Muscat in the presence of the two official delegations, where the latter renewed his condolences to President al-Assad and the Syrian people for the victims of the devastating earthquake. The Sultan of Oman stressed his country's continued support for Syria to overcome the effects of the earthquake, the repercussions of the war, and the siege imposed on the Syrian people. For his part, al-Assad expressed his deep thanks to the Sultan, the government, and the brotherly Omani people for the solidarity and standing with Syria and for sending relief aid, indicating that the greatest thanks are for Oman standing by Damascus during the terrorist war against it. The talks also tackled the bilateral relations between the two countries and the areas of joint cooperation where the two sides agreed to strengthen and advance cooperation in all fields. Al-Assad indicated that Syria and Oman enjoy relations of mutual trust and an old and deep understanding. Al-Assad noted that Oman has always maintained its balanced policies and its credibility. The region now needs the role of the Sultanate of Oman more than before in serving the interest of its people in order to strengthen relations between Arab countries on the basis of mutual respect and non-interference in the affairs of other countries, Al-Assad said. For his part, bin Tariq said that Syria is a brotherly Arab country and we look forward that its relations with all Arab countries returning to their normal state. The official talk session was followed by a closed session of talks before al-Assad and his accompanying delegation left the Sultanate of Oman. And here's some footage of their meeting. And from the Muscat Daily, H.M. Sultan Haytham receives Syrian President Assad. His Majesty Sultan Haytham bin Tariq received President Dr. Bashar al-Assad of the Syrian Arab Republic, who paid a visit to Muscat on Monday. His Majesty led the welcoming party for the guest when the jet touched ground at the royal airport. His Majesty the Sultan met the guest at the foot of the ramp, welcoming him, wishing him and his official designation or delegation a pleasant stay in Oman. His Majesty and President Assad held an official session of talks at al-Baraka Palace. At the outset, His Majesty the Sultan renewed his sympathy and condolences to the guests and the Syrian brotherly people for victims of the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and the Republic of Turkey. His Majesty affirmed that the Sultanate continues support for its Syrian brethren to overcome implications of this natural disaster. On his turn, the Syrian president expressed his utmost thanks to His Majesty the Sultan, the government, and the Omani people for their solidarity and stand with Syria. He also expressed his appreciation of the Omani relief efforts that contributed in alleviating impacts of the earthquake. And during the session, His Majesty and the Sultan and President Assad reviewed the march of the bilateral relations between the two brotherly countries and fields of joint cooperation. The two leaders also exchanged viewpoints on regional and international developments, as well as the endeavors to consolidate pillars of security and stability in the region and the world. After that, His Majesty the Sultan and the Syrian president held a closed-door session. President Assad and his accompanying delegation left in the evening after concluding his visit to Oman. The official session of talks was attended from the Omani side of Saeed Shahab bin Tariq al-Saeed, Deputy Prime Minister for Defense Affairs Saeed Khalid al-Busaidi, Minister of Diwan of Royal Court General Sultan bin Mohammed al-Nu'amani, Minister of Royal Office Saeed Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, Foreign Minister Sultan bin Salim al-Habsi, Minister of Finance Dr. Hamad bin Saeed al-Alfi, Head of Private Office Dr. Madiha al-Shaibani, Minister of Education Abdul Salam al-Murshidi, Chairman of Oman Investment Authority and Saeed Turki al-Busaidi, and Ambassador of Oman to Syria. And here's a clip from Press TV regarding the meeting.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has met with the Omani King Sultan Haytham bin Tariq al-Said in Muscat. Assad was received by the Omani King earlier on Monday. Officials from the two countries have met and discussed the expansion of bilateral ties. Meantime, the Syrian president thanked the Omani nation and government for their solidarity with the Syrian people in the aftermath of the recent devastating earthquakes. Bashar al-Assad's first trip abroad since the bloody quakes 2 weeks ago comes as many countries have taken steps to mend fences with Damascus in the past months. Some countries, including Oman, cut off ties with Syria after foreign-backed militancy started in the country in 2011. Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, have already indicated their willingness to restore ties with Syria, that after Syrian armed forces effectively defeated the foreign-backed militancy. Well, let me get the opinions in from Elijah Magnier, journalist and political analyst. Elijah, tell me your take on all this and the significance of this visit.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
It is indeed significant because it's an ouverture of President Assad visiting more than one Arab and Middle Eastern country, and also receiving, as you rightly said, the visit of the Jordanian foreign minister for the first time since years. So what we understand is that the earthquake is pushing all the Arab countries to have another look through a humanitarian window rather than the political aspect when dealing with the Syrian president, the Syrian government, and Syrian population. Not only, we've seen also European countries like Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Austria calling their European state members to accept the status quo and to acknowledge the presence of an elected president in Syria, and that whatever has been done in the past, we need to go over it. And they're calling to stop the boycott, to start the reconstruction, to lift all the sanctions, and to look toward the future, to build the future relationship with Syria rather than staying on the side. However, the war in Ukraine is keeping everybody busy. This is why the earthquake has attracted some attention, but it's not clear for how long this attention will be.
Right. Well, at the same time, Elijah, that you're talking about the various Arab countries trying to reestablish their ties with Syria. On the other hand, we have reports about, of course, dealing with the excuse of the earthquake. unfortunately, Western's continued support for the terrorists in that region of Syria. How do you see all of this working out? Do you see more of a clash between some of these Arab governments, regime, and the West, or a transition? Or your overall assessment of what's happening there?
It's quite disappointing to see President Biden following the exact step of President Trump. And both presidents decided to steal the Syrian oil and to protect the vast area in the Syrian desert that joined Syria and Iraq, blocking the border and preventing the flow of goods between both countries, but above all, even protecting the takfiri of ISIS that are attacking the Syrian, and recently several dozen of Syrian civilians have been killed by the terrorist group. Now we see that the Americans are not willing to make any step toward lifting the sanctions on the Syrian population, and this policy adopted by the Syrian president, which is Biden and before him Trump and Obama, to cripple the population and to wage a soft but very detrimental war on the population with the sanction. And that's been done with Yemen, with Iran, with Syria, with Lebanon. So all that is creating a very hostile environment against the West and against the US in particular, because they really don't want to stop doing what they are doing, and they are continuing to support what Hillary Clinton rightly said: the people we are supposed to fight today, we have funded in the past. But what we see today is we see the West is protecting the terrorist group and preventing the Syria from reconstructing their country and the Syrian army from going to get rid of these terrorist groups, because they are capable of doing so if the Americans do not impose a controlled area of 50 kilometers on the Syrian-Iraqi border.
Meanwhile,
And Prince Faisal's statement at MSC, Munich Security Conference.
Well, there is a consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. We all have policies, but we don't have any strategy to implement that policy. In that context, we need to rethink the policy. We need to rethink the policy in a way that addresses the main crisis points. We have an issue regarding refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon that are a significant drag on those economies in a very delicate time. We have significant suffering now, especially with the earthquake among Syrian civilians in Syria. The status quo is not going to relieve any of that suffering. So how can we address the impasse, acknowledging that there is no pathway towards achieving the maximalist goals that we all had in the past? So that's going to have to go through a dialogue with the government in Damascus at some point, in a way that achieves at least the most important of the objectives, especially as regards the humanitarian angle, as regards the return of the refugees, etc. So I think the only thing I can say at this point is that there is a consensus within the Arab world that the status quo is not working, and that we need to find some other approach. What that approach is still being formulated.
And from GD Online, Arab states need new Syria approach, Saudi minister says. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said consensus was building in the Arab world that isolating Syria was not working, and that the dialogue with Damascus was needed at some point to at least address humanitarian issues, including a return of refugees. You'll see not just among the GCC, but in the Arab world, there's a consensus growing that the status quo is not workable. Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud said at a Munich Security Forum on Saturday. The minister said without a path towards maximalist goals for a political solution, another approach was being formulated to address the issue of Syrian refugees in neighboring states and the suffering of civilians, especially after the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey. So, that's going to have to go through a dialogue with the government in Damascus at some point in a way that achieves at least the most important of these objectives, especially as regards the humanitarian angle, the return of refugees, etc., he said. Asked about reports that he would visit Damascus following visits by his Emirati and Jordanian counterparts after the earthquake, Prince Faisal said he would not comment on rumors. Riyadh has sent aid planes to government-held territory in Syria as part of earthquake relief efforts after initially sending aid only to the country's opposition-held northwest. Other Arab states remain wary, and U.S. sanctions on Syria remain a complicating factor. Kuwait's foreign minister told Reuters in Munich his country was not dealing with Damascus and was providing aid through international organizations. Asked if this stance would change, Sheikh Salem al-Sabah said, "We're not going to change at this point in time." And so watch this space. Also, just keep in mind that your engagement through a like, a share, subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction.